Thank you, Dr. Clerveaux, and thank you to the Honourable Deputy Premier, Sean Astwood, as well as our partner, Ronald Jackson from SEDEMA, and of course my boss, Regis Chapman, for opening the ceremony for us. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. And welcome again to the first symposium that focuses exclusively on the Caribbean. My name is Juliette Mon. I work for the WFP Barbados office, and this is my colleague, Yasmin Sweden. And we have the responsibility of ushering you through today's proceedings as Masters of Ceremony.
So, as we dive into the topic of shock-responsive social protection throughout the day, we'll be looking in detail at how countries can strengthen linkages between disaster risk management and social protection systems in response to different crises and shocks. We structured the day so that the morning will be dedicated to covering key concepts and approaches, and also learning from countries who have had first-hand experience in the use of social protection systems to responding to shocks. The afternoon will be more participatory, and we'll have different interactive sessions in which we'll be getting into the nitty-gritty of the preparedness for shock-responsive social protection. We'll explore potential investment areas across the region, and we will try to identify the priorities in the way forward towards a more responsive social protection in the Caribbean. After closing the symposium, we'll be holding a cocktail reception this evening, and we hope to see you all there to further the discussions in a more informal setting.
Thank you, Yasmin. Okay, before we proceed, I wanted to get over with the housekeeping. In terms of bathrooms, you want to leave the main entrance and turn to your left. The bathrooms are on your left-hand side. The breaks will be in the courtyard, in that area of the courtyard, and in the far end for the restaurant. I wanted to bring your attention as well to the fact that you have some copies on your table. The first has the Wi-Fi password for those who have not been connected as yet. You want to connect to the Shore Club, and the Wi-Fi access, the code is Holiday Memories with an exclamation mark, just as it's written on there. We're giving you the opportunity as well throughout the presentations to signal some questions that you may have through a platform called Slido. And Slido is really interesting because not only does it allow you to post anonymously, let's say if you have a burning question that you don't want to know who's asked it, but also for others to indicate through their likes whether they want that question to be asked or not. So you have two opportunities to flag questions, concerns, etc. through the Slido engagement. And these instructions are on your desk at the moment. For those who are social media savvy, we also have some hashtags and other things that we want you to use if you so desire. Okay, so without much further ado, I am very pleased to invite my colleagues to present on the theory behind shock-responsive social protection, what it means, and the concepts, the approaches, and some of the preliminary findings for the case studies mentioned by Regis Chapman. Ms. Francesca Ciardi, Program Policy Officer, World Food Program. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This session is actually with my colleague Rodolfo Beazley as well, who is hiding in the back. It's a real pleasure and an honor to welcome you to the symposium. You've come from far and wide to be with us here today, and it really shows a commitment and an invested interest in the topics of the symposium. We have the representation of 15 countries in this room today from the Caribbean region, and I thank you very much for making the efforts to be with us here today. And I very much look forward to the conversation that will unfold over the course of the day. I always have the hardest task, which means unpacking some of the key concepts and approaches of this word. What is shock-responsive social protection? So I'm going to do that in collaboration with my colleague Rodolfo Beazley from Oxford Policy Management. WFP has a long engagement with OPM on conducting a regional research study, and we'll also be presenting some of the preliminary findings from some of the studies we've conducted at the moment here in the Caribbean. Okay, so So social protection, putting people at the center of resilience. So on a broad level, we're seeing that social protection is being globally recognized as a powerful tool for alleviating poverty, mitigating risks, promoting resilience and economic growth, and is also seen as an essential part of many countries' poverty reduction and economic growth strategy. Many countries are making progress towards articulating national social protection strategies, policies, revising legislation, and some even well-advanced social protection systems in place. We also see an increasing investment to strengthen the capacity of social protection systems and programs to ensure adequate and predictable support. Furthermore, we also see an increase in the creation of fiscal space to be able to generate resources to fund social protection programs by, for example, increasing tax revenues, reallocating public expenditures, and other modalities. And this trend and the amassing evidence about its impact has also led to the explicit incorporation of social protection into the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular SDG 1 in ending poverty in all its forms, but also very much central to the achievement of many other SDGs. And finally, and the reason why we're also here, there is also a growing body of evidence that demonstrate with the right type of investment and strengthening approaches to social protection systems and programs, social protection can actually play a pivotal role in responding to a wide range of emergency through relief assistance, whether it's cash, voucher, in-kind food, such as the one distributed through school feeding programs, and in promoting recovery once the crisis is over. But what is shock responsive social protection? So, as my colleague Bridget Chapman mentioned before, social protection is intrinsically already intended to be shock responsive, in that it supports people in the event of a shock, help mitigate their exposure to shocks, and strengthen their resilience as well, for example, to climate-related events. Generally, social protection systems are considered to be more shock responsive when they can respond flexibly and at scale to large-scale events that impact a community and a population at once, such as economic shocks, natural hazards, and so forth. In practical terms, when we talk about improving the shock responsiveness of social protection systems and programs, these may entail, for example, improving the coverage of existing systems and their ability to expand at scale to absorb additional needs. And we'll talk a little bit later about data management and targeting. Also ensuring that delivery mechanisms are flexible enough to enable people to continue to receive assistance promptly, even in a crisis. Also enabling greater integration and coordination within disaster risk management strategy and in order to strengthen emergency responses. And finally, also improving access and diversification of disaster risk financing mechanism to scale up responses in a sustainable manner. And we have a lot of expertise in this room, and we'll be tackling these topics in more detail later during the day. Something key to mention is that any preparedness investment to strengthen the shock responsiveness of social protection will, of course, benefit the overall management, administration, and delivery of social protection overall on a day-to-day basis. So this type of investment that we advocate for are actually for the greater benefit of social protection systems overall. I just want to dedicate a moment to look at some of the complementarities between social protection objectives and emergency response objectives. The distinction between these two sectors' approaches, guiding principles, operational instruments is lessening. Traditionally, we see emergency response as addressing saving lives and the provision of basic goods and services at the onset of an emergency as part of emergency responses, whereas social protection is more focused on addressing chronic poverty and vulnerability. However, with this changing landscape in humanitarian crisis globally, we see also the approaches between these two sectors have to adapt in a way. So we see much more protracted emergencies, therefore emergency response is not anymore just to save life in the immediate onset of a crisis, but it becomes a much more multi-annual, protracted type of approach. And similarly, social protection often is delivered in a situation of poverty, extreme poverty, and in emergency response. So also the objectives are changing to that effect. And to look at some of the linkages between social protection and disaster risk management, if we look at the different phases of the DRM cycle, for example, preparedness, some of the DRM mechanisms would entail, for example, vulnerability, risk, and hazard assessments. This type of assessment can be used to design responses, but also shape the targeting of social protection programs to make them more shock responsive. If we look at the phase of response, the provision of cash and in-kind, for example, to assist impacted populations, existing social protection targeting and delivery mechanism can also be used potentially to provide assistance to disaster-affected populations. And similarly, social protection programs can also be expanded to provide additional support to those in need. And the Caribbean region is one of the most disaster-prone areas in the world, and climate change is expected to intensify and to contribute to some of the challenges that many Caribbean countries face around poverty and vulnerability. When a hurricane, a flood, or other adverse events strike, households that lack other options may resort to negative coping strategies. So this could include reducing essential food consumption, healthcare attendance, education, or selling productive assets. Often the intervals between shocks are insufficient to ensure full recovery. So while households continue to employ strategies that continually erode the resilience, and this cycle often sends the poor further into poverty and the non-poor below the poverty line as the risk capacity is low. Risk transfer capacity is low. The impact of natural hazards also further complicates labor market conditions in the tourism, agriculture, and fishery sectors, which are upon which many Caribbean countries heavily rely on. And moreover, climate-related disasters encourage migration, which could be a growing policy concern for the Caribbean, where brain drain is a serious impediment to growth. Within the context of poverty, vulnerability, and risk in the Caribbean, it illustrates the important role that social protection can play in protecting poor and vulnerable people from these impacts. This map shows different ministries and different programs currently in the Caribbean. Many Caribbean countries have basic elements of social protection systems in place. And with the necessary investments, they can be deployed to support disaster preparedness and response actions. These include social assistance, both cash and in-kind, school feeding programs, labor market programs, social insurance, and so on. These basic system elements are not necessarily designed for emergency response, but they can provide the foundation upon which a well-functioning and responsive social protection program can be further developed. Countries like Haiti, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, British Virgin Islands have already scaled up social protection programs to respond to shocks and continue in their efforts to build and modernize existing systems to improve their functioning, their delivery, and coverage. Other countries such as St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Vincent and Grenadines, and Belize are looking at ways to strengthen national systems to improve the delivery of regular programs and to scale them up in response to shocks. Caribbean countries' recognition of the significant contribution that a well-functioning social protection can offer is also illustrated in some of the countries' national plans, strategy, and SDG commitments. So this shows there is a lot of opportunities in the region. And again, by looking at the right type of investment to strengthen those systems, these systems could be leveraged to respond to wide risk scenarios. So now we just move rapidly to the next session, which is looking at different design options for emergency response and 5 dimensions for a strengthened social protection. And for this, we're going to show you a video.
Latin American and Caribbean countries are exposed to an increasing frequency and magnitude of natural disasters, partly as a consequence of climate change and to economic and political shocks. Can the region's advanced social protection systems play a role before, during and after a crisis occurs? This could enable reaching substantial segments of the affected population through tested administrative systems with potential for a quicker and more efficient response. But how can this be done in practice? One option is to provide top-ups to existing social protection programs by increasing the value or duration of benefits on a temporary basis. This option, called vertical expansion, is quick and does not require setting up new systems in the aftermath of a crisis. This solution has been popular in recent years. Peru, for example, vertically expanded the cash transfer programs Juntos and Poncho in response to floods, while Nicaragua provided one additional meal to school children in drought-affected areas. However, the key challenge with vertical expansion, especially when schemes are poverty-targeted, is that households affected by shocks are not necessarily those already benefiting from a social protection programme. Just imagine, this red circle is the population already covered by existing social protection programmes, each with their targeting criteria, and this is the population affected by a crisis. It is unlikely these will coincide. You will still need strategies to reach the remaining people. Other aspects of your social protection system can help you to do that. To be truly shock responsive, existing programs need to be able to increase the number of beneficiaries flexibly in the event of a crisis. We call this horizontal expansion. For example, in Haiti, the Clerveaux program, and in Chile, the Chile Solidario program, were horizontally expanded in response to recent disasters. Countries that have invested in a national database of existing and potential beneficiaries of social protection, a social registry, the green circle, could consider expanding support to all or some registered households in affected areas in the first phase of the response, before a register of affected households is developed. It would also be possible to rely on other administrative databases, such as Social Security or National ID databases. In any case, programme expansions or new emergency programmes by government and other humanitarian actors should be prepared to swiftly piggyback on the existing systems of regular programmes. Their databases and targeting approach, their coordination mechanisms, and most importantly, their delivery system. For instance, in Ecuador, the government and WFP responded to the earthquake with cash assistance by piggybacking on the capacity of existing social assistance schemes. However, not every social protection system is able to cope with the additional expense and workload required for such flexible response to disasters and shocks. So what recommendations are emerging from the regional experience? First of all, invest in strengthening data management and standard delivery systems, and ensuring implementation capacity, especially at local level. Secondly, develop innovative financing options, such as contingency funds and regional risk-sharing arrangements, a great example of which is the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. Third, prepare the system by pre-developing protocols, contingency plans, and stand-by agreements for rapid expansions. Fourth, strengthen the coordination mechanisms between social protection and civil protection institutions. Shock responsive social protection is a unique opportunity to better support vulnerable and crisis-affected people. There is much to learn and many great experiences in the region. Let's start from there. These findings are just a snapshot from research which is being performed in 6 Latin American countries and from an overarching literature review of experiences in the region. To discover more, please visit our website.
So, I'm just gonna go over briefly some of the design options that were illustrated already in the video, just to just to repeat some of these options. And the video is more focused on Latin America, but later my colleague is going to give you more of a perspective on the Caribbean with some of the findings from the studies that we just conducted. So when we look at design options for emergency response, 3 main options have been identified, and we're looking at what we call vertical expansion, so temporarily increasing the value or duration of benefits for existing beneficiaries. Horizontal expansion, temporarily increasing the number of recipients in an existing social protection program, and piggybacking, using elements of an existing social protection program or systems while delivering a separate emergency response. So these are some of the options. These are options that have been identified based on real scenarios, real situations where governments were utilizing their existing systems and adapting it in these different ways. And then finally, before I give the floor to my colleague, the 5 dimensions for a strengthened social protection that were also illustrated in the video look at information systems, so developing systems to ensure equitable distribution of resources, oversight, and linkages with other services, and how to do this, for example, ensuring the integration of database and information systems, and adding data on vulnerability to shocks to social registry. Targeting systems, adapting the targeting mechanism in order to allow for a better emergency response. How to do it, potentially developing contingency processes to register new beneficiaries, and linking protocols for coverage expansions with early warning indicators. Delivery mechanisms, so adapting the delivery mechanism of cash and in-kind transfers. This could be done by modernizing the delivery mechanisms, developing contingency plans for alternative payment mechanisms, considering, for example, pre-registering population in high-risk areas. Financing, aligning with resources for an integrated and sustainable response to shocks. This would entail perhaps improving access and diversification of disaster risk financing mechanism to scale up responses in a sustainable manner. And finally, coordination, so aligning with disaster risk management actors and protocols for an integrated shock response to emergencies. One could potentially look at formalizing the role of social protection in emergency response with DRM strategy and develop joint preparedness measures. So these are just some of the ideas and examples, and during the course of the day we'll be talking about these very topics both through real life examples of countries that have gone through these processes and some other best practices that we can draw from the region. Thank you for your attention. I'm going to give you, pass the floor to my colleague Rodolfo Beazley.
Thanks, Francesca. First, I want to thank WFP and CIDIMA for inviting me to participate in this symposium, and I look forward to learning from all your experiences in shock response and social protection. Okay. So, a quick overview of the main findings of the ongoing research on shock response and social protection in the Caribbean. Yeah? So, as Francesca mentioned before, we've been conducting, WFP and Oxford Policy Management have been conducting research on shock response and social protection in Latin America and the Caribbean since 2016. The project had 2 first phases, which cover 7 country case studies in Latin America and the Caribbean, and this included Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Dominica from the Caribbean, a literature review, and a number of conferences and workshops in which we engaged in conversations and discussions and studying the evidence generated by the study. Now, in the 3rd phase in 2019, the idea was to focus on the Caribbean, as Regis Chapman mentioned at the beginning, because of the new office of WFP in the region, because of the engagement and interest of CIDIMA in this area, and also because of the context and the challenges that Caribbean islands are facing. We have already conducted 4 case studies. We are going to conduct a 5th one in the second half of the year. We have already conducted a literature review with experiences throughout the region, and we are going to be engaging in a number of workshops and conferences, sharing this knowledge and of course learning from all your experiences. Okay, so quickly, in relation to one of the main ways in which social protection can respond to shocks, the vertical expansion that Francesca has described, which is basically about giving top-ups to existing beneficiaries. I mean, the main finding, of course, of this type of response is that it is fairly administratively easy to implement this type of response compared to the other ones that I'm going to describe in a few minutes, because it's simply about giving a top-up to existing beneficiaries. You use the administrative systems that are already in place, no? And we do see a few experiences in the region, no? In relation to social assistance programs. Jamaica, Dominica, and Haiti have used this type of strategy. In the case of Jamaica, and we're going to have a panel presentation later on this case, so I'm not going to go into the details, but the PATH program, the flagship cash transfer program, they gave top-ups to 90,000 beneficiaries in response to Hurricane Dean in 2007. In relation to Dominica, and I'm going to describe this in more detail in a few minutes, in response to Hurricane Maria, the government, with the support of WFP and UNICEF, gave top-ups to the beneficiaries of the public assistance program, and in Haiti, food vouchers were given to people affected by Hurricane Matthew. Social insurance schemes have also been used in this way, have been vertically expanded. In the case of Jamaica and Grenada, by giving top-ups to pensioners. No? Okay, in relation to horizontal expansion, that this is increasing the coverage of a program temporarily in order to reach those who have been affected by the shock but who are not benefiting from a social protection program. This is, of course, more complex because it requires adapting the delivery mechanisms, the targeting mechanism, the payment mechanism, and so on. There aren't many examples in the region, but the same happens in Latin America and elsewhere. We also conducted research in other regions of the world, and this is a type of response that hasn't been implemented a lot, precisely because it's complex and requires a lot of preparation. No? There is the case in the region of Dominica, which, in response to Hurricane Maria, the government, with the support of WFP and UNICEF, implemented the emergency cash transfer program, which gave, on the one hand, top-ups, vertical expansion to beneficiaries of the public assistance program, but on the other hand, they gave cash transfers to people affected by the shock, but who are not in social protection. No? And in order to do that, they had to conduct a vulnerability and needs assessment throughout the country to identify who had been affected. They also relied on local beneficiary selection committees who helped identifying the affected households, and on the criteria that you can see on the slide. No? The emergency cash transfer also relied on the cash payment mechanism used by social protection for the regular provision of benefits. That is a manual payment, and this is something important to keep in mind, because we tend to think that we need to have in place electronic systems in order to respond to shocks, but that's not necessarily the case, and in the case of Dominica, they relied on a manual payment system. In the end, 18,000 people received this, who were not in the public assistance program, received this cash transfer. Okay, in relation to piggybacking, this is basically a response by the government or by a humanitarian agency that piggybacks on the payment mechanism, on the data management database, for example, or on the staff and the capacity, the administrative capacity of social protection to respond. No? And of course, that it requires that one of these processes, the one that you're going to rely on, is strong enough. No? We've seen this experience in Jamaica in relation to the use of the payment mechanism and the staff of the MLSS to target those who have been affected by shocks, and also in the case of BVI, using the joint cash platform to respond to shocks. And we'll we're going to hear about these experiences later on. Then, in relation to the different preparedness areas, I wanted to highlight briefly a few findings from the research, from the ongoing research. In relation to the institutional arrangements, I mean, the starting point is that DRM and social protection have been designed for different purposes, no? However, despite the fact that have been designed for different purposes, in a number of countries we see that social protection strategies include roles in DRM, and the DRM strategies give social protection a role in DRM. No? So we see that there is already in the region, at least in some countries, this idea of social protection playing a role in DRM and DRM contributing to social protection as well. In relation to information systems, the main flagship cash transfer programs in the region tend to have electronic information systems. Then in relation to integrated registries, this is basically registries which connect databases from different sources. We are going to have a session on data management, but this is emerging in the region, and we only see a few countries with this type of interconnected, integrated approaches to data management. However, we know that this is a policy priority in a number of countries, and would be good to discuss this in the session about data management. In relation to targeting, social protection programs in the region have been mostly designed to reach the chronic poor. So if they're going to play a role in shock response, we may need to think about how to adapt those targeting mechanisms. And also the coverage and the reach of these programs is not high in many countries, and that could be a challenge in terms of reaching those who have been affected. In relation to delivery, as I mentioned before, in relation to Dominica, many countries have still manual payment mechanisms. However, this shouldn't be seen as a barrier to use such systems to respond to shocks. No? The issue would be to assess how good and solid these systems are, and we've seen in the case of Dominica, but also in the case of Jamaica, which manual payments have been used to provide support to people affected by a shock. No? In relation to financing, there is going to be a panel presentation about CRIF. That is one of the most innovative experiences in relation to financing and risk pooling. There are in the region also other strategies, mostly budget reallocations after the shock, and also a reliance on loans from donors. And we haven't found any protocols linking funding to social protection responses yet, no? And this is not surprising. It happens everywhere in the world, since this idea of shock response to social protection is fairly new and it's emerging. It is difficult to find countries in which there are already these protocols that link funding to social protection responses. No? So this is not a surprise. Finally, in relation to coordination, I mean, we heard the personal experience from Mr. Ronald Jackson in relation to Jamaica and how social protection has been coordinating with DRM and how this has been growing with time. We found a number of examples in the region. Of course, these are two different sectors that have been developed for different purposes, but we see that there are a number of recent initiatives to increase coordination. This conference is one of those, of course. And regional cooperation is well established, no? Through CIDIMA and other initiatives. Finally, I promise. In relation to the innovations, I wanted just to highlight this quickly, no? That they don't fall in the other categories, but they are interesting enough. So in relation to Dominica, after the emergency cash transfer response that I already mentioned, the following year, the government and WFP decided to give a one-off cash transfer to all the beneficiaries of the emergency cash transfer program right at the beginning of the hurricane season. So the idea was to give this cash to the poorest and people who have been affected by Hurricane Maria so that they could prepare themselves for the new hurricane season. This is an ex-ante type of transfer that is quite innovative, and we haven't found many examples of this globally. In relation to Jamaica, and there's going to be a panel presentation later on, there's a case management system for resilience that is very interesting, which helps people building resilience and through a number of interventions, including referrals to different social protection programs. In Grenada, there is this livelihood protection policy, which is a weather index-based insurance. And what is quite innovative is that it targets low-income individuals and households irrespective of their occupation. And finally, in relation to Dominican Republic, the SUBEN, which is a social registry, and we're going to discuss this later on, social registry with information about households who are in social protection and others who are not, is used, and there is a methodology called EVAC, which is going to be presented later today, that estimates the probability of a household to be exposed to a climate shock. And this is very innovative because it uses social protection databases to provide information very useful for DRM actions, in terms of preparedness and in terms of responses as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I give the floor back to the Masters of Ceremony, I just wanted to say I'm mindful of the time and we want to start with the panel discussion right away. So if you have any question, there is a Slido running in the background. You can post your questions and we'll answer them. Or you can find Rodolfo and I after the panel discussion at the coffee break, and you can also approach us then. So I'm just going to invite the Masters of Ceremony back here.
Thank you very much to my colleagues Francesca and Rodolfo. I would like to actually acknowledge the presence of the Honourable Edmund Hinkson, Minister of Home Affairs from my beautiful country, Barbados. Welcome, Minister. Okay, without much further ado, we're going to proceed to the panel discussion that focuses on the challenges, opportunities, and best practices for linking the disaster risk management machinery with that of social protection. I'd like to invite the moderator, Ms. Elizabeth Riley, Deputy Executive Director of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, to join us. Thank you, Elizabeth. Ms. Judith Alpuche, Chief Executive Officer, Belize Ministry of Human Development, Social Transformation and Poverty Alleviation. Dr. Evangeline Inniss-Springer, Deputy Director, British Virgin Islands, Department of Disaster Management. Dr. Virginia Clerveaux, Director, Turks and Caicos Islands, Department of Disaster Management and Emergencies. And Mr. Isaac Anthony, Chief Executive Officer of the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility, SPC.
Honourable Ministers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to Session 1, where we will explore the linkages between disaster risk management and social protection in the Caribbean, looking at challenges, opportunities, and best practices in social protection for the marginal and the most vulnerable. My name is Elizabeth Riley, as you've heard, and I will have the pleasure of moderating the first panel this morning. I want to also issue a special welcome to our online participants who are joining us live via the link socialprotection.org. Thank you very much for being able to be with us. So what are we hoping to achieve in this first session? We have identified 3 specific objectives, which I'll share with you. First, we want to unpack some of the key concepts, challenges, and opportunities for linking disaster risk management and social protection in preparing for, responding to, and mitigating the impacts of major shocks. We also want to identify priority preparedness areas and ex-ante investments in the areas of data management and targeting, delivery mechanisms, financing and coordination to improve the overall effectiveness and delivery of social protection, and to bring it at a scale in response to crises and shocks. And thirdly, we want to take this opportunity to share with the audience insights into Caribbean countries' experiences, approaches, and future plans. We want to exchange knowledge and best practices that can inspire others, foster South-South cooperation, and regional linkages. Thank you. To support us in unpacking this area, I'm joined this morning by a very distinguished panel, and I'm going to introduce you to the members of the panel. To my immediate right is Ms. Judith Alpuche. Ms. Alpuche is the Chief Executive Officer of the Ministry of Human Development, Social Transformation, and Poverty Alleviation of Belize, a post which she has held since 2008. Under her leadership, the social safety net programs in Belize managed by the ministry have been modernized, including through the implementation of a conditional cash transfer program, as well as several ICT management solutions. In her position as CEO, she chairs the Relief and Supplies Management Committee of the National Emergency Management Organization and has managed the country's humanitarian relief response to 4 major natural disasters. She holds a master's degree in social work, a bachelor's degree in political science and sociology from St. Louis University in the US, and a certificate in executive leadership from the Canadian School of Public Service and the University of the West Indies. Please give a warm welcome to Ms. Alpuche. To her right is Dr. Evangeline Inniss-Springer, who is the Deputy Director of the British Virgin Islands Department of Disaster Management. Dr. Inniss-Springer is a certified emergency manager and certified continuity manager who has over 25 years experience in the disaster risk management field, having worked at the regional level with CDEMA, internationally with the Pan American Health Organization, and of course nationally in the BVI. In her capacity, she leads the social sciences unit that has responsibility for translating science into action with a focus on influencing behavioral change at the community level and integrating comprehensive disaster management into all sectors. She holds a master's in health studies from the University of Alabama, a doctorate of health sciences from the A.T. Still University with a focus on leadership and organizational behavior, as well as professional designations in emergency management from the International Association of Emergency Management and continuity management from the Institute for Business Continuity Training. Please welcome Dr. Inniss-Springer. To my immediate left is Dr. Virginia Clerveaux, who is the Director of the Turks and Caicos Islands Department of Disaster Management and Emergencies. Dr. Clerveaux has been working with the DDME since 2001 and currently holds the position as Director. She has regional experience, having worked with us at CDEMA, and she has also worked with the British Red Cross, including immediately after the impact of Hurricane Ike in the TCI. She holds a PhD in civil and environmental engineering with a focus on disaster management from Gunma University in Japan, a Master of Philosophy and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Geography from the University of the West Indies, and a Diploma in Education from Shortwood Teachers College. Please welcome Dr. Clerveaux. And to Dr. Clerveaux's left, we have Mr. Isaac Anthony. Mr. Anthony is the Chief Executive Officer of the CRIF SPC, and many of you would have known that previously to be the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. And this is the world's first multi-country risk pool providing parametric insurance. Mr. Anthony has over 25 years' experience in senior management, spanning the areas of public finance, financial sector supervision, and economic planning, having held key positions with the Government of St. Lucia, including Permanent Secretary, Finance, Economic Affairs, and National Development. He has served on several boards, including those of the Caribbean Development Bank and the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. Currently, he is the chairman of the National Insurance Corporation in St. Lucia and a commissioner of the Eastern Caribbean Securities Regulatory Commission. He graduated from the University of the West Indies with a bachelor's degree in economics and accounting, and also holds a master's in business administration. Please welcome Mr. Anthony. As you can see, we have an eminently qualified panel this morning, and we're really looking forward to the discussions. So to get the ball rolling, I'm going to pose my first question to Dr. Inniss-Springer. So, Dr. Springer, thinking of the various stages of disaster risk management, in your view, what role can social protection play in mitigating the negative effects of crisis and shocks, and to build resilience to climate change in the Caribbean?
Good morning, and thank you so very much, Ms. Riley. I'll start by giving a little story. 6 persons can live in an area where they're all susceptible to flooding, coastal inundation, and perhaps hurricanes as well. But each one of those entities are able to be able to respond differently because of the systems and the policies that are in place. Mitigation looks at being able to tap into those areas to be able to reduce the negative impact. So when you think about social protection and the description and the definition that we got earlier in the presentation before, we're looking at a series of policies. So that's where policies and programming, so that's where I can see social protection fitting in. But in order for it to be, to have a very trickle-down effect, it has to be backed with and integrated into a disaster risk management system that is effective and robust, and we also have to have an enabling framework, which would be our legislations, and we also have to, I'm going to look down at the end, financing options and a diversity of financing options. Persons must be able to recognize also that they can be, they know how they can tap into, and I heard a lot about a social registry. So we have to identify where those pockets of vulnerability, where those pockets are very early, so that we can have access to that information. So we don't have to wait until the flooding has occurred or the hurricane has impacted for us then to be able to go identify those persons. We already know where those persons are, and we can provide before, because we're looking at mitigation, so we can provide some means to be able to help those persons respond better to the shock if and when it happens. And then to support that social registry as well, we have to have a mechanism in place as well for persons to self-register. So you may not be identified in the national capture, but you need to have a space for persons to be able to say, you may have missed me, but here I am also having a challenge, I have been impacted, for them to be able to get some type of assistance pretty quickly before they actually start to spiral. So that's where I see it being able to integrate, and the key here is being integrated into a robust and a comprehensive disaster risk management system.
Thank you very much, Dr. Inniss-Springer. And I think the responses you've given are certainly reinforcing some of the critical points which were raised in the opening presentation, particularly the area of the strengthening of the data management. And I think the recommendation you made in terms of the not only the pre-identification of persons, but the elaboration and really strengthening of the social registry is a very key point. So let's go now to get a perspective from our social protection representative who's on the panel. So, Ms. Alpuche, how can social protection, in your opinion, be better prepared for and adapted to respond to the multiple risk scenarios that we face in the Caribbean? And in particular, what ex-ante investments and preparedness measures should be prioritized in your view?
Thank you so much. I think there was a lot of discussion this morning on this particular question that's being posed to me, really highlighting the point that was made over and over again, and we need to make it over and over again, that social protection is just such an integral part of the response. It's really about the whole issue of ensuring that people, vulnerable populations, have what they need to be able to roll with the punches, if you will, building resiliency for people, ensuring that they have the ability to respond to crises. So any work that is done in terms of strengthening social protection systems is really about, ensuring that you are prepared and can respond properly when these huge shocks, particularly since we're looking at hazards, natural hazards, when these huge shocks occur. And I think the video this morning did a very good job of highlighting the areas that I believe are so critically important in terms of investments ahead of time. The trick is really to have the system as robust as possible ahead of time. And so there's been much talk about information systems and data systems, social registries, beyond beneficiary registries. And so I really want to kind of highlight that a little bit because, the construction of these social registries, at least from our perspective in Belize, it can be daunting. How do you find the resources to be able to get everybody in the system, or as many people within your population in this system so that you're able to identify them beyond people who are already in your data systems because they're receiving some benefit. And in Belize, what we've done is really try to look at every possible opportunity to be able to populate our social registry. We started out with the census about 10 years ago, and using that information, getting people's permission to use their information to start with the basis of our social registry. And we're looking at our next census to try to expand even more. Understanding, of course, that these registries are not static, so looking at that aspect also. We have partnered with the Ministry of Education because they have an education subsidy program. And every year, children register for this program beyond our own beneficiaries from social safety net programs. And so we have really partnered with them to populate the social registry. We use every opportunity within our case management system that is called FAMCare to use that information to populate the registry. So really looking at where those points are. Belize right now is initiating or is well on the way towards a national spatial data initiative, and we're really looking at, okay, so how can we use that to populate? We have a BHIS, social security and social insurance information. So looking at all the possible windows, if you will, to be able to get information on people. And then, of course, when all else fails, how do you encourage people to register? Because, and really to sensitize people about the use of the registries, no? So I think it's, although it may be, it's not something immediate, but it's something that really needs to be done to be able to have the data to respond and to meet the needs of people. targeting mechanisms, we talked about that this morning. I think that's critically important, so that you have, before the heat of responding, that there is sober thought to an objective targeting mechanism, and that the mechanisms are in place, if you will, to make sure that you can identify very quickly those people who have been most affected, those who are vulnerable, and be able to do some of the ex-ante work, as we saw with one of our Caribbean countries, that the example that was given, where they anticipated and provided assistance to people ahead of time of the natural disasters, as well as how do we respond afterwards. So having an objective targeting mechanism is critically important and well worth the investment. The institutional arrangements, making sure you have proper legislation, if that's what you need, or executive sanction, or whatever gives legal weight to the work that you will need to do. And having everybody understand, all the entities understand their role as well. And many times it's worth cultivating this understanding nationally about social protection systems, and it's beyond whichever ministry deals with issues of social safety nets. And we have really invested time in Belize in doing this. We, for the past, since November of last year, have had a series of social protection conferences where we're talking about social protection in all its forms, and bringing in more non-traditional actors, if you will, helping the Ministry of Labor to understand itself as a part of the social protection system, helping the Chamber of Commerce and the labor unions and etc. Talk about these issues and come to a common understanding. We most recently, with good support from the World Food Program, had one on shock responses, social protection, and disasters. So really having a clear understanding and appreciation by all involved of their role and responsibility, I think is really, and the potential role that they can play if they're not playing it yet, is well worth the investment ahead of time. Delivery mechanisms, how are you going to get the benefits out there? We've invested in Belize in financial inclusion and bankarization. That's been very useful. With our conditional cash transfer program, Boost, which is similar to Jamaica's PATH, we have 98% of our beneficiaries bankarized. And we see that as part of the strengthening of the system and part of the extension of social protection. We've worked with credit unions, and I don't know if it's the same in the Caribbean, in the rest of the Caribbean, but in Belize there's a certain cultural piece to credit unions, where people who at the lower echelons feel more secure when they're a part of the credit unions. And what we've found is credit unions have been willing to work with us. People have been able to use the small transfers, and these are vulnerable people, to leverage small loans from the credit unions to secure debt benefits, to secure education, grants, etc., for their children. And so to me, that's a part of the resiliency also that prepares people. So really looking at how you're going to deliver, and how not only in the face of responding to the shock, but how can you build delivery systems that do some of that resiliency work on the front end. And of course, we've talked about financing mechanisms. So I think those, to my mind, are the major pieces. And any strengthening of your social protection systems, and any investment in understanding collectively that you're all a part of that system in the final analysis. Anybody working on national development can be brought into that conversation, because when we have these huge, particularly natural disasters, that is what is at stake, our national development and how these can retard us. Just a few of my thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you very much for such a comprehensive response. And I think the audience would be really encouraged by the types of innovation that we're hearing about in Belize, and certainly the points that you've made about not just the capacity strengthening of the various actors who are supporting the area, but also that point on partnerships, I think has been really critical in coming through from the discussion. I may want to come back to you a little bit later on how you have addressed this issue of the pre-identification of persons. So for example, within the Sedema Resilience Framework, it talks not only about the persons who are vulnerable, but it also talks about the marginal. So I want to come back to you on that in a couple of minutes, so you can have a minute to think about that. So let's move over to my left. So Dr. Clerveaux, we're looking again from the lens of the disaster risk management practitioner. And the reflection I would like to invite from you is, what are the gaps and opportunities to better link disaster risk management, social protection, and climate change interventions?
Thank you very much. As we know, there is a relationship between disaster exposure and investment in social development. The greater the investment in social development leads to a reduction in risk. There are many gaps that we can readily identify in the Caribbean, and one such would be the case of the Department of Disaster Management, the Department of Social Development, and Climate Change sometimes fall under 3 different ministries, which leads to operating in silos. You find duplication of effort and some extent of ineffectiveness. So to me, that would be a very strong area of concern. We also have social protection systems that exist, and where they do exist, their intended purpose may not be realized immediately after an impact or a shock. Another example that I could provide is the fact that social protection systems that do exist, the persons that are on the list do not necessarily coincide with the list of persons that you will find immediately after an impact. So persons who may be impacted by, for example, hurricane, may not be able to immediately benefit from existing social protection systems that are currently in place because of the criteria that exist for accessing those programs, such as welfare benefit checks. In addition to that, we have institutional coordination, just trying to work with the various agencies or ministries that exist that have some role to play regarding social protection, whether it be in health or it's in education or disaster or social development it is. Another gap would be conceiving the benefits. How do we decide what persons should get, when they should get it, and the quantity they should get it? And the whole issue of resourcing in the Caribbean, financing it is always an issue for us. Nonetheless, there are opportunities for this. In the region, there are systems that already exist. There are social protection systems that already exist. Instead of reinventing the wheel, we can look at tweaking the system that exists to ensure that we plug in to existing systems that would allow us to not only reach those that are already in the system, but also a wider population. We can also look at horizontal expansion of the system as well, and that would allow us to be able to provide greater benefits to persons.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Clerveaux, and I think some very useful insights there, particularly with respect to the points that you've raised on how our national systems are organized, and that real opportunity for better integration of the work within those organizations in the national system. And of course, one of the points that you raised was related to the aspect of financing. So that gives us a very good, I think, segue into bringing Mr. Anthony into the conversation. And the perspective I'd like you to share, Mr. Anthony, is on what are some of the mechanisms and opportunities to ensure the fiscal sustainability of integrated disaster risk management and social protection responses in the region?
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Yeah, well, as you indicated earlier, I'm really from a Ministry of Finance background. And based on that experience, and certainly the experience that I've seen through a number of countries in the Caribbean over the years, I'm really pleased to see the transformation that is taking place. In fact, there's a clear paradigm shift taking place with respect to how people deal with the issue of social protection. You know, in the past, there was a lot of emphasis, and there still is a lot of emphasis on achieving fiscal and debt sustainability. But unfortunately, that was sometimes seen to the exclusion of dealing with issues of social protection. And the simple reason for that was because there was a thinking that we needed to be able to achieve sustainability, that is fiscal sustainability, where we can release more resources in the system that will support investments in capital projects. And with those capital projects, potentially they will also support the creation of jobs, employment, etc. But in the face of climate change and the impact that we're seeing on the Caribbean, particularly with the growing frequency and intensity of hurricanes and so on, and other disasters, natural disasters, now there's clearly a shift. So we've seen the shift from seeing the issue of fiscal and debt sustainability together with social protection as moving from being mutually exclusive to one where there is greater complementarity in those areas. And as we talk about that, one of the most important developments that has certainly taken place over the last 12 years is the emergence of CRIF, which is the organization that I represent, which is the world's first multi-country risk pool, providing what we call parametric insurance. And the whole idea is to be able to provide quick liquidity to governments in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. And what really prompted the development of CRIF was Hurricane Ivan in the year 2004, which saw significant devastation to Grenada and Cayman Islands and to a lesser extent other countries. But the losses were so significant. I mean, $8 billion. I mean, it really prompted, it was like a wake-up call to the governments of the Caribbean, where they decided to approach the World Bank to set up some form of disaster risk financing facility. And since CRIF has been established, we have actually made payouts totaling $139 million to 38 individual payouts, of course, to 13 individual governments. But the important thing here is to be able to see how those payouts has really impacted government, given the government the ability to be able to respond, to natural disasters, and also to be able to provide the immediate assistance that is needed, particularly to the poor and the vulnerable. I mean, we've clearly seen what has happened in Haiti, one of the more disaster-prone countries, certainly in the Caribbean. Certainly we've seen it with the earthquake of 2010, and of course we had Hurricane Matthew in the year 2016, with that country receiving about $24 million in payouts. And again, a significant of that actually went to the poor and the vulnerable, providing food, temporary shelter, medicines, and so on, all because of that immediate payout that the government was able to receive. In my own country, in St. Lucia, Matthew actually affected that country. The $3.8 million in payout that the government received, they actually put all of it to the sector that was most affected, and that was agriculture. Most of it actually went there. So we actually see the impact of this, and as we speak, there are a number of other things that we are looking at as CRIF. For example, in fact, on Monday, July 1, we will be launching a fisheries product in Grenada and St. Lucia. The whole idea is to be able to enable the government to be able to provide coverage where those resources in terms of an insurance product will be made available to the individual fisher folk. We are very excited about that, and we actually see how this is beginning to impact some of the more vulnerable areas. But insurance is not the only mechanism. I mean, there are other forms of disaster risk financing. Some of them have been cited before. For example, I mean, there is a contingency fund. We've always encouraged countries to, regardless of what other instruments that you have, you really need to plan, do some financial planning to ensure that you have a contingency fund which enables you to be able to respond almost immediately. And of course, some countries are also taking advantage of other credit, what we call contingency lines of credit, offered by the World Bank, the IDB, and other international financial institutions. So we actually see, we know how those mechanisms are beginning to impact not just the government, but the people who are considered to be the poor and the vulnerable.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that, Mr. Anthony. I want to explore the points you've put on the table a little bit more, because what I'm getting the sense from what you said, whilst we understand, of course, that the decision-making with respect to the use of the CRIF payouts that's of course a government and a sovereign decision. But certainly it sounds to me as if there's a space where national governments can give a level of consideration as to how they may be able to support the shock responsive social protection mechanisms as a part of the considerations of how the resources for the CRIF payouts could be used. So CRIF would recently have published a policy brief which would have linked social protection with climate resilience and adaptation. So my question to you is, what are some of the key recommendations to governments to align social protection and climate adaptation strategies?
A very important issue. As a matter of fact, you would probably be aware that this really came out of CRIF's involvement in what is called a CREG project, which is called Caribbean Risk and Adaptation Insurance in the Caribbean project, which is being implemented in collaboration with the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative and the ILO in 5 targeted countries. And the whole idea is to support insurance at the microinsurance level. There's one particular product called a livelihood protection policy that was made available, for example, in Jamaica, St. Lucia, Grenada, and now it has been promoted in Trinidad and of course, in Belize. And the key point here, and in terms of the points that you've raised, is that we want to be able to, and one of the key recommendations that we would like that the country, that when governments receive a payout, that a certain part of it is actually earmarked, specifically, right, as a social protection strategy targeting the poor and the vulnerable. I mean, that is actually key. Just for the benefit of the audience here, I mean, when governments receive a payout, it is governments, the use of those resources are really at the government's discretion. But I think we now need to move beyond that and say, look, governments, there are clearly people that are considered to be vulnerable or affected, and you need to be able to target a certain amount of this. The other thing that we would like, and as recommended in the paper, is the increase in use of microinsurance. So in other words, let us move beyond just providing or targeting the governments. Why don't we promote the increasing use of insurance at the microinsurance level? And that is why I raised the issue about the fisheries initiative, which is going to be launched on Monday. We also spoke about the livelihood protection policy, targeting, again, the vulnerable seasonal workers, agricultural workers, farmers, fishers, and so on. And we're also looking to come up with other types of initiative at the microinsurance level. So, but in order for that to happen, there has to be a role that the government has to play. Insurance is typically not cheap, as you know. Although the insurance that CRIF provides is a lot cheaper than the government or anybody would otherwise find anywhere else, whether you decide to go on the international insurance markets and so on. The reality, though, is that the insurance that we provide, it's really based on a risk pooling, and CRIF really operates as a not-for-profit. So at the end of the day, the residual benefits that CRIF that it provides all goes right back to the members. So that is actually one of the reasons why it's a lot cheaper, in addition to the fact that it's actually based on risk pooling. The other thing that we have to consider is that if we want to encourage individuals to buy insurance, we need to find a way of incentivizing them to buy. So for example, we may consider, for example, providing subsidies. Now I know that is not a particularly popular word with some institutions, but it is something that we have to find a way of addressing. And it can be done in a very innovative way. For example, there is no need, we could find a way of subsidizing by the removal of taxes, bearing in mind that we are targeting the relatively poor, the vulnerable, and so on. So these are some of the points that are highlighted in the paper, and of course we can always expand on that a bit later.
Thanks very much for that insight, Mr. Anthony. And I suspect the delegates may wish to ask a couple of questions, particularly on this area around CRIF and opportunities for financing, etc. And before I come to the audience, I actually want to go back now to a national perspective, particularly as it relates to the discussion we've just had on the CRIF and the potential avenues for how the CRIF might be able to support the social protection mechanism. So I want to turn to the BVI, because the BVI is in fact one of the very new members of the CRIF, having joined this facility only in 2018 after the devastating impacts of Hurricane Irma. So my question to Dr. Inniss-Springer is, what are key considerations to further optimize disaster risk management and climate change adaptations in the BVI in support of long-term sustainable development?
Thank you, Ms. Riley. I think what I'll share here is this resilience model that we have developed here in the BVI, and it is built on those three fundamental pieces of disaster management, where you're looking at safeguarding lives, protecting property and the environment. So as I listened to my other panelists, a couple of things jumped out at me. The whole, and that are all embedded in this resilience model, which takes us towards the whole thing of having, in terms of sustainable development. So we're looking at that whole thing about building capacity among the citizens and the residents of BVI, those persons who have an interest there. Because we see here, and it came out, I think, with my colleague from Belize, the whole thing of recognizing that other entities are going to be tapping into whatever systems that you're going to be developing. So we need to be able to build capacity with our Central Statistics Office. We know there's a space for our CBOs and our NGOs to also collect data. How are we doing it to make sure that whatever we are collecting has that strong evidence base, that when we are using it for decision making, it is something that we can rely very heavily on and have that confidence in. The piece about protecting the lives of the residents and visitors with a very focus on the vulnerable, and for us the marginal, because we spend a lot of time thinking and focusing on those persons who are most vulnerable. But shocks, when they do happen, put persons on those margins that if they are not dealt with effectively or within the short term, they can then spiral into becoming the most vulnerable. So then you have a larger population to be able to deal with. Safeguarding livelihoods, that piece about microinsurance. We have been having a discussion through the Craig project for a couple of years, but because we are OT, we were not able to benefit from some of that funding. But now we are a member of CRIF, we are pushing ahead to be able to have that discussion. I can see my minister there smiling, because that's something that they are very, very key on, and to try to see how we can have that microinsurance, that livelihood protection. And we are expanding it past the fishers and the farmers, but for anyone in the BVI who is interested in having that. So that whole piece about safeguarding livelihoods. Building resilient infrastructure, because it is, if we continue to just focus on people without recognizing that we need to also have infrastructure that is robust, and not only for climatic hazards, because there's a focus, very heavy focus on the climatic hazards, and we tend to forget that the geophysical ones and the other types of hazards can have an impact on the society as well. And the integration of disaster risk management in all sectors. This is the productive sector and the social sector as well. So that is what we have all rolled up, although it's a very quick snapshot of it, what we have rolled up in the BVI that we are calling our resilience model, that is helping us to be able to tackle and tap into those key components: people, property, and the environment as we continue to be able to build what we call in BVI a smart community. And that smart community is one that's able to withstand shocks and to be able to help persons get back up if they are impacted in the shortest possible time. I can go on and say plenty more, but in the interest of time and recognizing the rest of my panelists, I would stop here.
Thanks so much, Dr. Inniss-Springer. And I think the BVI model is really a very interesting one, certainly within the CDEMA system, in terms of how the whole issue of resilience has been integrated at the sectoral level. And we're also looking forward with great interest to see how the livelihood protection and the social protection is going to be looked at in the BVI, now that you're formally a member of the CRIF. But I want to, before I come back to the members of the panel, give the audience an opportunity to pose any questions. We've had many issues that have been placed on the table. We have some excellent cases from Belize, from the BVI, experiences from the Virgin Islands. Are there any questions you would like to pose to the panelists at this point in time? Yeah, BVI in the front row.
Thank you very much. My question relates to insurance in respect of low-income households. In the BVI, the housing sector, I think, took the brunt of the damage. We have a lot of persons that were displaced and are still displaced and could not at that time afford insurance for their properties, and insurance rates have tripled now, so they're in a worse position. And we have a program of assistance to help to rebuild and repair homes, but we have to find a way to provide, even if it's microinsurance or some facility that would help those households to at least insure the more vulnerable parts of their homes. So I was wondering if a facility such as CRIF could be an option for countries to look at, specifically for the housing sector.
Yeah, very good question. And in fact, this is something that we've been doing a lot of analysis on. And in fact, when I leave here, in fact, I go to a meeting with the World Bank specifically to discuss this issue, because we recognize that it has come up as a major issue. Clearly, we've seen what has happened in the countries that have been affected by both Irma and Maria. I mean, you spoke about BVI, but I mean, Dominica, it was also quite bad, as well as other countries. So we clearly seen that there's a very significant amount of vulnerability in those areas, and we need to address it. Unfortunately, there's always the issue about market failure, and that is what has really made CRIF really possible. Because where the market is really not able to respond, CRIF has to find an innovative way of responding to those needs. So you spoke about households. Indeed, this is an area we are looking at. One of the things that we are now even considering, whether we should possibly consider offering hybrid products, which is a combination of what parametric insurance as well as the traditional indemnity insurance to be able to deal with some of those issues. I like your suggestion about even being able to build on the livelihood protection policy to be able to address this issue. But the point I really want to make is that we are in fact giving that attention, and we're hoping that in the not too distant future, we'll be able to come up with a product that addresses specifically that area and that particular problem.
Can I invite one other question from the audience? Yes?
To Ms. Alpuche, could you give us some more information regarding the bankerization and how you were able to change the mindset of beneficiaries? Because what we've seen happening is that when we tried to introduce that, person felt that government was trying to mind their businesses, and they were not opting for that.
What we did was, as I said, I don't know the cultural pieces in other Caribbean States. But for us, there's a cultural piece that we piggybacked on where people who are poor believe that they have arrived or there's a status to having your credit union book. And so we really built on that in terms of doing some financial literacy in the beginning, educating people, etc. The credit unions were really wonderful about working with us because they don't charge any kind of fees or anything like that. And they worked with us in terms of just signing up people as members of their credit union. So it was really piggybacking on that cultural belief that there is a bit of security, or people believe that they're at a different level. And what we had in the beginning was a very undignified all social assistance program where people had to line up to receive funds. And so it was, moving from that to really having people step into a credit union because they have business. We didn't use banks because that's a bit intimidating to people in a way. From a cultural perspective, we use the credit unions that are more friendly and more open to people of lower socioeconomic level and have a history. And so they were very good at working with us. And what the government did in the first instance was to pay the opening share for your credit union. And that really helped us in terms of beyond financial inclusion, because a lot of the families that we were dealing with, we had to help them get birth certificates and social security cards, identity cards, etc. So it was really using that as a way also of beyond financial inclusion, but social inclusion for this very vulnerable population. No?
Thank you. I'll just come back to the audience for one final opportunity for a question. Yes, Honorable Minister from the Bahamas.
Good day. My question is in relation to what is being suggested with the microinsurance, farmers, fishers, and now possible homeowners. Could you give us any idea as to what kind of response you may have gotten from the quote-unquote regular insurers in regard to this move?
Yeah. Interestingly, there hasn't actually been any negative feedback from them. And I think it's only because that they have recognized that CRIF actually came into a space where we needed to come into, where certainly the product was not being provided. But having said that, there's been some interesting recent developments now, because now people are beginning to see the value in parametric insurance, and I think we have really played a very important role in promoting that particular product. And so some of the big international insurance companies are beginning to see how potentially they can provide similar products based on parametric insurance. So for example, without going into all the details, you would have heard recently, you may have heard that a particular international reinsurance is in the market, maybe promoting reef insurance, and potentially there could be other areas as well. So the point I'm making is that while initially there has not been any negative feedback or reaction coming from them, but perhaps in the not too distant future, we would probably expect that increasingly they may want to get involved. But at the end of the day, we are confident as CRIF that we are more competitive because we operate as a not-for-profit company where all the residual benefit goes right back to the members, unlike those big international companies which essentially are in the business for optimizing profits for the benefit of their own shareholders.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anthony. I believe the BVI would also like to contribute in response to that question.
Yes, thank you. I just want to share a national perspective. When we were looking at the microinsurance and we did the feasibility study, the insurance companies were all at the table. And one of the things that they have said to us is that they really appreciate a product like this because what they're looking at is a stepping stone towards traditional insurance, because there's a segment of the population who don't have very much confidence in it or some level of mistrust, so they can use that, and they're very interested to be able to see how they can support the process, because they can see ultimately persons will want to go towards the traditional insurance. But that's in the BVI context, though.
Okay, thank you very much. I know we probably have some additional questions which persons may wish to pose, but I'm also being cued that we have only about 5 minutes left. So what I would like to do is to invite our panel to really share maybe a final parting thought or recommendation that you would like to make to the audience. Please remember, you can also feel free to engage the members of the panelists during the break, which is going to immediately follow the session. Thank you. Thank you very much. So you can also feel free to engage members of the panel during the break immediately after the session as well, and we have some time for that. So perhaps I will start to my left, Dr. Clerveaux. I'll give you the opportunity to make some final statements or share a final thought with the audience.
Thank you very much, Liz. Just to emphasize that I'm definitely a supporter of social protection systems, and after an event we have to be very careful. I'd like to appeal to donor agencies and humanitarian groups that when you do come into a country, you want to plug into existing systems that already exist and not to run a parallel system against what exists. In the case of Turks and Caicos Islands following Hurricane Irma and Maria, we saw cases of systems running parallel, which led to duplication of effort. Sometimes it led to stress. And we also had situations where persons come into the country with a preconceived notion of who they think are the vulnerable population. What we would like to see is a more plugging into existing system, whether it's a disaster office or it's a social protection system. Let us work with you to identify the vulnerable groups, and let us ensure that in implementing the social protection systems or shock response system, that we do not result in greater stress than is necessary, because there is the rule of the law that must be abided. While you do have your principles, you do have your policies, but we also have legislation and ordinances that states how we go about doing business in the country. So with that being said, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clerveaux. And let's get a closing perspective from our delegate from Belize.
Thank you. I think there's been a lot said, and I keep reflecting on the fact that although we're at different places in our journey, there's just so much rich information and experience right here in the Caribbean. And I truly appreciate this coming together. And I hope that we can see that sometimes we look outside ourselves or outside our region for the answers. And a lot of it can be, it's right there within if we understand ourselves, if we understand this issue as one of national development, really, that at its core it is. And really start that conversation nationally, helping each other. We talk about silos a lot, and it's the discussions and the understanding of what is at stake sometimes that helps to break down those silos. So I'm very encouraged. For us in Belize, it's a work in progress, but I'm encouraged and buoyed by all the richness of experience in this room. And it's something that, we sit down and the urgency, I think, is something that we really do appreciate, because it's not if but when, and how are we able to together be ready to deal with these shocks that come from these huge impacts from natural disasters that really set us back for decades in some instances. So I'm truly encouraged that it's a mammoth task, but that we're getting on the same page, and there's so much that everyone has to contribute.
Thanks so much for this perspective. BVI?
I think for us in the BVI, and I'm going to go out on a limb and try to speak for my PS and my minister as well, and to talk about the whole issue of collaboration and to ensure that the social protection and the disaster risk reduction systems are well integrated, and do you have robust and comprehensive enabling frameworks behind them? So as my colleague from TCI would have said, when external entities come in, they recognize that there's a place to be able to plug into. And I know during Irma and Maria, we worked very, very closely with RPS in the Ministry of Health, but our minister was not there with us, but he was supporting us through the Lions Club as well. So there's also a space for NGOs and CBOs to be able to contribute. So it's not, we have to take down the silos, recognizing silos will exist, but we have to have one comprehensive and integrated system that pulls all of the entities together, because at the end of the day, we want to ensure that our people can be able to get to maintain dignity and to be able to respond to any type of shock, regardless of the factor that's actually causing that shock to happen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Inniss-Springer. Mr. Anthony?
Yeah. Just want to make the point I made earlier in terms of the transformation. That's a lot better. The transformation that we see taking place in terms of how we view disaster risk, in terms of being a very key element of fiscal risk, and that it should be treated as such. But an adjunct to that is the whole idea of social protection and treating that as a risk that needs to, as an issue that needs to be managed. And I'm really pleased to see this transformation taking place. And all I would like to do at this point is that we encourage the countries to continue along that path. And very importantly, that we really pay serious attention to how we finance risk, how we finance disaster risk. This issue is not going to go away. And so we should not take the issue lightly, that we need to consider the different mechanisms that are available to you. We've spoken about insurance, but there are other mechanisms as well that one would consider. And I'm glad that Dr. Inniss made a very important point earlier with respect to how the local insurance companies view CRIF and insurance. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why some of them actually do embrace what we're doing is that I think it is helping to restore some confidence in that sector that has been eroded because of some very bad experiences. So all in all, it's looking very good, and I would certainly like us to continue along this path. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anthony. So we've had, I think, a very wide-ranging and robust discussion around this whole topic of how we are looking at the linkages between disaster risk management and shock-responsive social protection systems. I won't be able to summarize the full scope of the conversation, but I wanted to highlight just a few of the key points that I thought came forward in response to the 3 objectives that we'd set ourselves. So with respect to some of those key concepts, challenges, and opportunities, there are about 5 points or so I wanted to pull out. I think first of all is that underwriting principle that the linkages have to be people-centered, where we are given due consideration not just to the vulnerable, those who have been pre-identified as being vulnerable, but also the marginal. I think that is a very critical point. And I know we didn't get the chance to talk about exactly how we would go about doing identifications of persons who are potentially marginal, but I do think that that is an area that deserves a level of treatment. And also in that point was the whole aspect of the maintenance of human dignity. I think that's one of the key principles coming out. In terms of the other areas that came out under that umbrella, policy and enabling environment as key vehicles to move the area forward, and the importance of having robust national disaster management systems. And I think the investment in our national disaster management systems is so critical because we recognize that for these types of arrangements to function, we have to have very strong established national system. So it's a very important place for investment. We also talked a little bit about building upon the existing systems, and you heard about some of the systems which exist in our states as demonstrated by the members of the panel. And on the financial side, I think there were a range of opportunities that were identified here, including how national governments can give consideration to utilization of CRIF payouts. Maybe this is an area that can be looked at from a policy perspective as to how we treat shock responsive social protection issues within the addressing how we are utilizing funds from CRIF payouts. We also underscored the importance of the opportunity of the financing of disaster risk outside of the conversation of insurance, but looking at some of the other mechanisms and how we engage our non-governmental organizations and CBOs. The second priority treated the whole aspect of priority preparedness areas, and the panel made a range of recommendations here, which included the importance of capacity strengthening in the area of shock responsive social protection systems. We also talked a little bit about ex-ante investments as it relates to information data systems and how we integrate technology, and also how we build the requisite partnerships ahead of emergencies so that we're able to respond appropriately. And certainly, I really want to thank the members of the panel for the existing country experiences which were shared. We heard quite a bit of innovation from the example of Belize, and I really enjoyed the what was shared by the CEO of Belize with this, in this regard. We also had quite a bit of innovation with respect to the CRIF and how they're looking at treating the whole issue of livelihood protection going forward in some of the micro-insurance initiatives that are being explored there. And of course, from the BVI, we had the example of some of the models which are being utilized there, including the SMART approach to how you treat resilience. So I want to ask you to join me, please, in thanking our panelists. And just to remind you again, our panelists were Dr. Evangeline Inniss-Springer from the British Virgin Islands. We also had joining us Ms. Judith Alpuche, who was the CEO in Belize in the Ministry of Human Development, Social Transformation, and Poverty Alleviation. Dr. Virginia Clerveaux, Director of the Turks and Caicos Islands Department of Disaster Management and Emergencies, and Mr. Isaac Anthony, the CEO of the CRIF SPC. Please give them a round of applause. And once again, my name is Liz Riley. It's been my pleasure to moderate this morning's first session, and we invite you now to break, and I suspect our facilitators will give you some additional instructions. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to acknowledge the questions that were raised online on Slido. We are in the process of responding to some of them, and I believe that some also were covered by the panel in the question and answer. Now it's time for break, for coffee, for water, and to stretch your legs. We are running a little bit behind schedule, so I would appreciate if everyone could congregate again at 11:30. Thank you so much. looks at the regional examples on how countries have used social protection for emergency preparedness and response. I'm pleased to welcome the head of WFP Barbados Office for Emergency Preparedness and Response in the Caribbean, Mr. Regis Chapman, and the panel members, Ms. Patrona Davies, Permanent Secretary of the British Virgin Islands, Ministry of Health and Social Development, Ms. Velda Octave Joseph, Permanent Secretary, St. Lucia, Ministry of Equity, Social Justice, Empowerment, Youth Development, Sports and Local Government, Ms. Colette Robert Risden, Permanent Secretary, Jamaica, Ministry of Labor and Social Security, and finally, Mr. Edwin Jose Gomez Martinez, economist from Dominican Republic, Single System for the Identification of Beneficiaries, SIUVIN, Social Policy Cabinet. Thank you.
Testing.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome to this second panel on looking at regional examples on the use of social protection for emergency preparedness and response. So I have the pleasure to be joined by a distinguished panel, and I just want to highlight that within everyone's folders we have the full bios, but just to maybe put the faces to the names of who was just mentioned. So first we have P.S. Patrona Davies from the British Virgin Islands, the P.S. of the Ministry of Health and Social Development. P.S. Velda Octave Joseph, the Permanent Secretary, St. Lucia Ministry of Equity, Social Justice, Empowerment, Youth Development, Sports and Local Government. To my left, P.S. Colette Robert Risden, Permanent Secretary, Jamaica Ministry of Labor and Social Security. And then Mr. Edwin Gomez, he's an economist in the Dominican Republic, Single System for the Identification of Beneficiaries, or the SIUVIN, Social Policy Cabinet. And my name's Regis Chapman, as was mentioned. So again, this panel, I think, builds a bit on that first panel, and it's looking at it through a slightly different view. And while much of this symposium is really focused on ex-ante investments and what we can do before an emergency strikes, the panel up here is going to talk a little bit about their actual experiences in trying to link social protection and emergency response. And I think it's important that we take stock of experiences in the Caribbean to date, and that we obviously try to continuously learn from the past. So we're going to open it up, and similar to the last panel, we'll have some specific questions for each of the panelists, and we'll make some room for the audience to ask questions as well. But perhaps if I can start with P.S. Davies. Could you describe the Joint Cash program? The Joint Cash platform launched by the ministry in the aftermath of Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017. What were the key considerations to initiate such a type of response, and what kind of challenges and opportunities did you experience during the design and implementation of the program?
Thank you, Regis, and good morning to everyone. So the Joint Cash platform, as we call it, really describes a collaboration that took place in the aftermath of a trio of disaster events that affected the Virgin Islands in 2017. We had major flooding in August. Irma directly impacted the Virgin Islands in September, and closely followed by Maria. And so we had wide-scale damage and persons displaced and severely affected. And beyond the initial response of in-kind relief and emergency vouchers, we realized that we had to put in place a system that could allow persons to meet their own needs based on certain eligibility criteria. So the collaboration was mainly among agencies of the government, the Red Cross, the British Red Cross, as well as its branch in the BVI Red Cross, Catholic Relief Services, working through Caritas Antilles, the UK Department for International Development, and then the Adventist Development and Relief Agency. So funding was pooled, our efforts were combined, we worked collaboratively to design and deliver, monitor, and evaluate the program. And in terms of the considerations, you asked why we decided to take this approach. So the British Red Cross had assigned a cash expert to come out to the territory immediately following the impact of Hurricane Irma. Her name is Zara Rizvi. She and her team did an assessment of the situation on the ground and advised that the markets were functioning in a way that would allow persons to be able to meet their basic needs. The financial institutions were also beginning to come back to a sense of normalcy. And we also felt that cash was the most effective and efficient means by which to achieve some objectives. First, allowing the vulnerable households to meet their own needs as part of their self-recovery, and to stimulate the local economy, because there's a limit to which we can receive donations of goods into the country. So we each had various roles to play in order to make the collaboration successful. So on the government side, the Social Development Department, the social workers in particular, did a lot of the groundwork in terms of the assessments and verification of the lists of potential beneficiaries. The Red Cross was a key partner, not only in terms of managing the bank account for the donations that came in from various sources, but also because they were a trusted partner in the community, particularly among residents who would not normally benefit from public assistance and may not feel confident in approaching the government for support. But we realized that in responding to a disaster, you have to take account of people's human rights, and a humanitarian response is more concerned about need than issues such as nationality, which limited our response through the regular public assistance program. So this approach helped to address those challenges, and Caritas carried out the monitoring during that time. So some of the features that made it function well was the use of ICT. So we used the Clerveaux software, and we gave the social workers tablets to go out into the field so that the registration information could be managed more effectively and closer as possible to real time. And we ended up distributing between $800 and $1,200 per household based on certain criteria of obviously income and level of impact, but also looking at issues such as family size, the presence of infants and seniors and persons with special needs in the household. And the 3-month period was thought to be a sufficient time for persons to be able to regain some independence and get back into the job market, as so many businesses had to close as a result of the immediate impacts. So in terms of challenges and opportunities, of course we had no prior experience of this, although we had been given cash through a public assistance program to a very small segment of the population. We had never had to respond to disasters of this size and to scale up as rapidly as that. And as I mentioned, under public assistance, there are certain limitations in terms of status in the country that could not be relied upon in this case. Communication was a challenge because our communication networks had been disrupted severely. And so getting out in the community, relying on traditional methods, and we are multi-island territory, so transportation challenges also factored into that in terms of being able to access remote communities. But what made it work was we were building on what is already a very robust national disaster management framework. And as part of that, we have a Health and Social Services Committee where agencies such as Red Cross and other NGOs and government agencies have been working together over the years to come up with plans and mechanisms for responding to disasters. So we were able to build on that and incorporate the partners that were new to the country. So in the immediate aftermath, you have a lot of new players on the ground, but it's important for government to lead that coordination effort to make sure that we're all singing from the same song sheet, so to speak, and working towards the same objectives. So with the open-mindedness of the persons involved, the expertise of the cash expert that was on the ground at the time, we were able to make it a successful collaboration.
Thank you very much. And you actually touched on an interesting point that was actually one of the questions posted online in the last session, and you mentioned a human rights approach. And actually, Mr. Jackson, in his introduction, also highlighted issues about movements across countries. Now, P.S. Octave Joseph, St. Lucia wasn't significantly impacted in 2017, but in the end, you did actually have a bit of a role to play. Like many other countries in the region, a number of nationals from Dominica sought refuge in other countries, including in St. Lucia. Could you tell us a little bit about how you addressed that, how you responded to those needs, and any thoughts on looking ahead in terms of, in light of the risks and vulnerabilities within the Caribbean region, what needs to be done in advance to sort of think about these movements of people and how best to address their needs, irrespective of which country they live in?
Thank you very much for that question. Sounds very complicated. I will start with the first part of the question in terms of the assistance and the role of St. Lucia in supporting Dominica after Hurricane Maria in 2017. I will begin my response by saying that St. Lucia has many social assistance programs. And I'm sure having said that, you would also begin to think that we also have many arrangements for delivering those social protection programs. The good news is that some of these programs can be very readily and very easily expanded or scaled up, and that was the case in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in Dominica. I will speak to some of the arrangements that were expanded, and I will speak to them within the context of contributions from the Ministry of Equity, which is the ministry that I represent. It is now just the Ministry of Equity, Social Justice, Local Government, and Empowerment. I will also mention the contributions of the Ministry of Education and that of the National Emergency Management Organization, because these entities really formed the package of support that was offered to our brothers and sisters from Dominica who came to St. Lucia for assistance. We do have many social assistance programs. I will focus on the public assistance program. We heard of the same program in the Virgin Islands. We were able to expand the current program by, first of all, developing a social assessment form, and that was used to do a very rudimentary assessment of the persons who were being referred to for assistance or who were walking in for assistance. And we were able to add those persons onto the list of persons who are already receiving social assistance. We were able to deliver cash grants. We also have a voucher system. It's a food voucher system that we provide to certain categories of persons on public assistance, and that was also used to support our colleagues from Dominica. The housing assistance package was also used to support our colleagues in terms of providing rental accommodation for persons or families coming in from Dominica. So we did not place persons within a shelter setting, rather we sought to provide them accommodation, and it again speaks to dignity issues and making sure that they're comfortable post the impact that they would have suffered in Dominica. We provided a level of educational assistance, and that was primarily through the contribution of supplies for school purposes. And I'm just saying that is what we focused on, because the Ministry of Education would have focused on other educational assistance programs. With respect to the Ministry of Education, we saw the facilitation of students in schools and also placement within families. That arrangement was actually made through a formal arrangement with the Ministry of Education in Dominica. So it was really a formalized agreement in terms of who was coming to St. Lucia, what schools that they would be going to, what families are available to provide support for these students. And so it was a very formal arrangement in that regard. The ministry also ensured that they got educational assistance in terms of uniforms and books, and were also placed on the school feeding program. In terms of what was obtained from the National Emergency Management Organization, we note that the organization has the authority to enter into agreements with suppliers for food items, as well as a number of non-food items. That arrangement is available at the national level, but it is also available at the district level. And so the district disaster committees are also able to enter into and to sign a memorandum of understanding with local suppliers so that they are immediately able to activate these systems in the aftermath of disasters. The issue would have been to be able to identify those families that require the assistance and to provide the assistance at the community level. I have mentioned those that form the packages, the basic package for our colleagues from Dominica, but within the ministry, we also have 2 critical programs that can readily be scaled up to provide support for vulnerable persons in the aftermath of disasters. We have the stimulus package, and we also have a caretakers program. Both of these programs really speaks to community programming, beautification at the community level, community projects, and they are actually run in partnership with the local government authorities or the constituency councils, as we call them. So these programs are programs that can easily be activated to provide some kind of support for vulnerable persons in terms of ensuring that they receive cash, but also it has the impact of ensuring that we also get work done within communities in the aftermath of disasters. The second part of your question, which speaks to displacement and to considerations for what needs to be put in place, we started that conversation with IOM in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Maria. However, in retrospect, I believe that there really needs to be a regional approach to this. I think there needs to be standards, there needs to be a set agreement, and here I am really thinking about CARICOM and the role CARICOM will have to play in that regard. I am thinking that there persons move freely and have access to the resources and the services that are available in the host country post-disasters. I am sure it would require a lot more thinking, a lot more review of what exists, but I really do think that it requires a regional approach to displacement.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being brave enough to take that last part of the discussion, question, not an easy one. P.S. Robert Risden. So Jamaica is one of the leading examples of the region on the linkages between social protection and disaster risk management, from the use of the flagship program PATH to respond to emergencies, as well as the ministry's role as the chair of the Humanitarian Assistance Committee for Emergency Preparedness and Response. Much can be learned from your experiences. What would you say are the key lessons learned and best practices that would be worth sharing with others around the room here?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Jamaica, in terms of our vulnerability index, we're ranked 27th in the world out of 172 countries in terms of our vulnerability to natural disasters. And I think because of the history that we have, dating back as far as the 1800s, where we had a piece of legislation that today is still on the books, we have been fortunate to have a very developed social protection system. And you mentioned PATH, but where I want to take the conversation is what have we done in terms of our new thinking. So yes, we have used PATH to vertically, and when we were doing it, we didn't think of it as vertical expansion. We just knew that we have persons who are already assessed as poor and vulnerable. We have a natural disaster, and we needed to provide quick relief to persons. So our history, yes, we will provide immediate emergency relief to persons, families, communities, and we have a very developed system in Jamaica for that sort of distribution network with our shelters in terms of providing comfort items, food, and so forth. But here it was in the mid-2000s, we were facing a number of tropical cyclones, and we were able to vertically scale up PATH to be able to immediately respond and provide assistance to persons. We used the National Insurance Program, which targets quite a number of older persons. But the fact is that we know that disasters, and it has been said before, disasters disproportionately impact the poor. And I think it was Francesca that had a graph, a line graph, which showed, poverty and, how disasters impact persons. What we are doing in Jamaica is, while we're providing all of that kind of support, if we have an immediate, to be able to immediately respond in the aftermath of an event, but how do we build the long-term resilience of our people? Because the fact is, if we can raise the standard of living, if we can raise the income levels of persons, if we can improve on the level of savings, their education, and so forth, then yes, we respond immediately, but in the long term, by doing all of those things, we would have equipped the individuals with the capacity that in the aftermath of an activity, their recovery is not slow, but their recovery is more like this. And so that is where, a lot of our social programs and systems are heading now. So we have PATH, which, as was said before, we have expanded vertically, we have piggybacked, all of these nice phrases that we like to use now. But what we are doing is, through our various social programs, how do we provide our population with labor market interventions, with micro enterprise activities, so that we can build their own resilience, so that when an event happens, yes, the government, the NGOs, all the social actors will come in and provide that immediate support. The governments of the region, all our donor agencies will never be able to provide the kind of support to truly rebuild families and lives. And so, it's up to us to look at, within our own space, how do we take that conversation more towards resilience building of our people? Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I think I found a new ally in the region on my push to remove all these terminologies that we use to put things in nice, neat boxes. I agree. I don't think it's necessarily about the vertical or the horizontal expansion, but so much of it comes to what you know about your population and the data that you have available. Our next panelist from the Dominican Republic, so the Dominican Republic has had a lot of experience in developing a social protection information management system. And it also includes something which I think many countries around the region here are striving to look at as well, which is a disaster vulnerability index built within that. So as these other countries are interested in developing the similar type of a setup, what lessons from Dominican Republic could you share to the other participants?
Thank you, Regis, and good morning to everybody. Briefly, I'm going to explain how we built our social registry. That is one of the most important things that you have to have in your country. The official measure for poverty is the monetary poverty, right? So, and it's built with the Ministry of Economy. And they determine which are the priorities 1 and 2 for intervention in our country. So we go every 4 years and update our social registry, and we have all the information gathered from all the household, having parents, sons, education, characteristic of the house, everything. So it's not a surprise that in the Dominican Republic is one of the country that is in the path of most of the hurricanes. And we, a few years ago, with the collaboration of the UNDP, we developed the EVAC. EVAC is the Vulnerability Index for Climatic Shocks. And now we can measure each household of our database and which one are vulnerables. So when we have an approach of these hurricanes or floodings, rains, we can intervene that house as soon as quickly. Most of, it's amazing because like we have a registry that is updated every 4 years, so that database is updated, so we have a live database. We provide information to the National Emergency Council and the Operation Emergency Center. So when we are in the path, for example, Irma and Maria in the 2017, they plan the work, how they can evacuate, how many people that they are in those vulnerable area. And they also, for example, they sat with the president and they say, these are the people or these are the households that they need to be prioritized because they're vulnerable. And because we have this database and it helps. Because when you plan, you don't go like, there's maybe 20 families over here, 30. We go with the name, we go with how many are of them. So the IVAC, it's been useful in our country by the emergency offices that. So I think.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open up a question to any of the panelists that want to try to take it on. So many of the experiences, not just in the Caribbean, but I think around the world, and WFP's experiences to a large degree as well, have been very much reactive responses. So an event happens, we go into, say, Dominica in 2017. We recognize very well that WFP and the international community establishing a parallel system, as was mentioned in the last panel, is probably not the most efficient way. So how could we build on what already exists? And of course, social protection systems exist. So we took that path. A lot of what we're advocating for now is really about these ex-ante preparedness investments. But listening to the example of BVI and some of the other countries around the world, do we need to do that? Do we need to put all this emphasis on preparing these systems beforehand? Or should we just say, you know what, leave it, let's keep these two areas separate, and we run in after an event happens? What's, I guess, the added value of investing in preparedness versus just, recognizing that at a government level, the two entities talk together and we make it work when something happens? Any thoughts?
We're dealing with people's lives. And yes, while we have to react when something happens, we have to be prepared. And so we have to build the systems internally. So, but let me say publicly, thanks to WFP and the World Bank, from Jamaica's perspective in terms of the kind of support that you have been providing to us in the recent past. But we can't just sit back and react. We have to prepare. We have to build our communities, because at the end of the day, if we prepare, we build our communities, then it means that we are able to get back to normal in a shorter time than if we sit back and wait on something to happen. Jamaica has been fortunate, and I'm looking for the wood to knock on in the last couple of years, where we haven't had an event. But despite that, every year we still go through the process of bringing all of our major players together in a space and a forum where we just assess all of our key response agents, our state of readiness and our state of preparedness. And as simple as you see it, I was mentioning to Minister Mackenzie, who has direct responsibility for ODPEM, that as simple as you see it, that act of just calling persons together once a year, at least, mind you, it's supposed to happen at least quarterly at the local level, but at least at the national level, if it's even once a year, by the mere fact of bringing people together, it brings into their focus that I may not have had something in the last 2-3 years, an event, and you know how we are, we tend to get complacent, but just that act of bringing persons together for us to discuss where we are, the state of our systems, our preparedness, our response mechanisms, ensures that when an event does happen, because as Judith said, it's not if, it's when it happens, how quickly do we respond, and getting everybody sort of in tune and aligned to their roles and responsibilities.
I just want to add my voice to support what PS has indicated. I really do think that social protection and ex-ante social protection is really fundamental to any conversation on risk reduction and resilience building. I think if you are able to help persons to build resilience, then it augurs well for their preparedness levels to deal with any impact or any shocks or eventualities. It's always interesting to me to recognize the concern in terms of airing preparedness messages, in terms of ensuring that people hear preparedness messages. But I think what is also critically important is that persons are able to action preparedness messages. So you're asking them to do a number of things, but you do have persons who do not have the capacity to be able to do a number of things. Persons who are receiving a very small stipend at the end of a month. We're into the third week of the following month. We were expecting a hurricane, for example, and you're saying to them, get your canned foods, get your water. They do not have the funds to be able to do that. How can our social protection systems be adaptive, be flexible, to be able to activate the cash transfer system that you can actually pay them outside of the regular routine pay period, to be able to allow them to go and do the things that are required to be prepared. So I think we need to begin to focus on these things, focus on what are we doing to ensure that persons can build resilience in the long term, but ensuring that persons can actually effect the preparedness messages that we're putting out there.
Okay. Now that I've gotten my loaded question that was meant to just make sure that we're here for a reason out of the way, perhaps we can open it up to the audience if there's specific questions for any of the panelists.
Edmund Hinkson, Barbados. I just wanted to perhaps expand a bit on what Mrs. Octave Joseph would have spoken about in terms of a CARICOM or Caribbean response to assist other countries in terms of taking in some of their citizens when their country has been struck by an event. And I was wondering, because the OECS, I must say, leads CARICOM on issues of freedom of movement and Caribbean integration. And I always say that. And for example, when Maria struck Dominica, I was then opposition shadowing education, and I called on our government to take in Dominican students, certainly at primary, secondary school level, even at our community college, because clearly their education system would have been disrupted for at least a term. And I was wondering, if OECS, well, you said that we have to look at And I was wondering how far you all have got in terms of that kind of policy or protocols that, you know, we as probably a Caribbean region at CARICOM level can look to see what policies we can bring into place, certainly for education of children to continue at, you know, in other CARICOM countries that have not been affected by the disaster, so that that fundamental and significant aspect of the training of our youth would not be disrupted to a significant extent.
In terms of a specific policy for displaced persons or policy on migration, that has not been effected as yet, as that is a conversation that is happening. But as you would know, based on the free movement regime, that OECS nationals could come across borders and be welcomed within particular OECS states. And so this is what really happened after Maria in terms of Dominicans coming into St. Lucia and being able to reside. I think there was a temporary removal of the fees for work permit, and they were allowed to become employed in the regular employment opportunities in St. Lucia. I have to indicate that even now, we still do have Dominican nationals on our social protection system. We still do have a few of them on our PAP program, the Public Assistance Program, and that is really the extent of the support that was able to be provided. But I think at a more formal level, that we need to begin to discuss and to begin to look at how we put together an agreement and how we actually formalize that framework in terms of ensuring that persons can access, not only that they move across borders, but that they can access the systems and the services that are available within the host countries. So it's not a matter of persons just coming in and remaining and trying to do things on their own, but there's a support system that would be offered to those displaced persons.
Any other thoughts on that, or?
I would just say that I would say the OCS has a long history and practice of supporting each other in that respect. You'll find in the Virgin Islands there's a large population of Vincentian nationals, for example, dating back to the volcano of many decades ago. Monstrations were integrated following the volcano. But for the first time after Irma, we had the reverse, where we had to rely on St. Lucia because our prison was compromised, and we temporarily relocated prisoners to St. Lucia. So that support is there in practice, but I certainly do support the formalization in terms of protocols, so countries can easily rely on what to expect in such a situation.
I just wanted to add, I was made aware very recently of an agreement. It's a non-binding agreement called the Global Compact for Migration. That was discussed in December 2018. It was actually launched then, and it really gives consideration to supporting persons who have been displaced by disasters. And I think as part of that, there will be a fund, and that fund is already, capitalization is already beginning. It's a target of 25 million. And that is really an initiative of IOM and PDD, which is the platform for displaced persons. They're the ones leading that initiative. And that is really, support can be accessed through the UN resident coordinator. So things are happening. It's a matter of ensuring that we are part of the process, we are part of the system, and we can actually influence what is happening to benefit us in the region.
Thank you. I think we had two other comments in the front.
Good afternoon. I'm Bonnie Richardson-Lake, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Social Development in Anguilla. I had two questions. First, I was hearing about the support that St. Lucia offered to Dominica, and you're talking about sort of formalizing those agreements. But I'm actually wondering more about how it's funded. So you've taken in all of these children from Dominica, and you've provided housing for all the people, a lot of people from Dominica. Who paid for that? Is my first question. My second question has to do with targeting. It's very clear that we need robust systems in advance of any kind of disaster event, but it's also clear that we need to beef those up in the event of disasters. So Dominican Republic and BVI spoke about social registries and actually going out into the field and registering people and making sure that we're keeping track of people. I was wondering if each of you could say a bit more about how that was actually done.
Okay. Let me see, how can I? Every 4 years, well, we have a social registry that's was created in 2004, but by decree or by law, we have to go every 4 years. In our database, we have each chief of the house or every member of the household. So when we go to update our database, we do a sweep. We go each household of that area. Yeah, we go every household and we do a questionnaire that has 89 questions, and where we ask about child care, discrimination, a lot of questions. So we keep track on them by the years, because those persons are most of them, not the entire database, are the ones that are in the cash transfer programs of Prosoli. So we need to monitor them in the years how they've been advancing, how they've been progressing. And there's the part of the IVAC that I said earlier, that when it's expensive. Having a database of that size, it's very expensive. We recently, the last year, we did our third study, socioeconomic study, and that's what I'm going to tell about the IVAC. That when you have, for example, Ms. Davis, she has her household and her family, but then Regis and the house they're near, but they have a different vulnerability index. So we can approach to them in a different way, we can help them in a different way. But yes, having a database that big it's complicated, yeah. And most of all expensive.
Yes, Davis, do you want to touch on that point as well before we?
Yes, we are in the process of designing what our ultimate social protection information management system would look like. What we have is the data that we gathered from the rapid assessment immediately following Irma. As I mentioned, we used an app which allowed us to collect this information in one database very easily. And then we have a housing recovery assistance program, which also has data on those households that at least applied for assistance under that program. And then our pre-existing programs, I think ultimately what we want to do is to be able to combine data from various sources and see what we have in terms of what we understand of the community. But at the moment, we're doing a country assessment of living conditions, which is another way to say a poverty assessment. And that will provide some rich data. And then the 2020 census is coming up. So we want to piggyback on all those efforts to try and have an understanding and be able to map out the pockets of poverty and vulnerability in the country, and then use that information to design and better respond to needs.
The census in my country is a term used by the Statistics Office. We use the term sweep. In our database, we have around like 2 million of households, but not all of them are poor. They are houses that are in poor areas, but for example, you have a poor house, and side by side you have the house of the mother of a baseball player, but they're in the same path of gathering the information. So we have that information also from that house. So, like I said before, when you have that database, you have a lot of information. You can do everything that you want. You can plan everything. So it's for all the countries in the Caribbean, and it's very important that you can search for that little bit of money so you can build that database.
In the first part of that question, and then we'll go to the last question. From
The very simple answer is the government of St. Lucia. Through budgetary allocations to the ministry under its welfare program. As you heard this morning from one of the presenters, I suppose there would have to be some reallocation of resources from another program, but the government paid for it.
Yes, Carvin Malone, Virgin Islands. There is an emerging issue. I think that RIF will have to look at this because a number of households are being placed below the line because when Irma hit, disasters were met. The insurance companies, I would arguably state, for their own benefits, to pay lower amounts out, were allowed to revalue every property. And you had too many cases of where folks who were paying premiums under the pretense that they were fully insured now found out for the first time they were underinsured. And 50%, 75%. When you turn around, banks are leaving the Caribbean area, so they were holding on to whatever little premium you did receive and trying to apply it against what loans you could not pay for September, October, November, December during the times that you were most vulnerable. Turn around and you now have to pay on values that were twice that you were paying for if you did get your house repaired. And then they carried up the rates by 100%. So now folks who could hardly meet their premiums before cannot make them now. So you have to increase your budget because there are a lot of folks who, if they were to be hit tomorrow, they cannot because they do not have the insurance. Banks are repossessing homes, and they don't have the means in which they will do this. So having some form of insurance that can look at the most vulnerable part of the house, the roof and the windows, maybe if you can get it broken down to that, then folks will have some kind of coverage. But it takes not only the financial part of it, but it will affect the social part because you would have to find more monies to help more people in difficult times.
Anyone would like to address any of those aspects? I think very, very valid points and part of the very difficult challenges. And I mentioned in my opening remarks the issue of a recognition of fiscal space limitations. And later in the day, we'll be having more sessions specifically that touch on disaster risk financing. And hopefully we can delve in a little bit more and see what sort of options. We've heard about the CRIF, but what else? Risk financing needs to involve a degree of risk layering as well. So it's not just relying on one mechanism or one tool. And I don't think there's necessarily a cookie cutter model that can apply to every country either. But we'll look to you to explore that topic a little bit further. We'll take one more last question. Yep. Oh.
Hello? Yeah. Okay, could I make a comment rather than a question to my colleague ministers from Virgin Islands, right? Yeah. He has summed up very succinctly one of the challenges that we as small island states in this part of the world have when we deal with, I suppose, the multinational banks, mostly Canadian. And quite frankly, Barbados hasn't been directly struck recently, so I didn't know that there was that problem where at your most vulnerable, the bank still insisting on paying your mortgage and taking up your house. And I just want to throw out, it's probably need a Caribbean response to these multinational banks on the issue that, legislation be passed that they just can't do that because that is so unreasonable, what he described there in terms of their response to still insist that they get their money on mortgages and repossessing your house when you just can't do any better. But outside of legislation, and I could understand, it can't be Barbados alone legislating, it has to be all the islands pulling together and saying that this can't happen because, it's affecting our people.
All right, and I think we had one more last point in the back there.
Good afternoon, everyone. Charnel Henry with the Jamaican delegation. I have a question for P.S. Roberts-Risden. I know that Jamaica has already, you stated that our social protection program, the PATH program, and the others came specifically out of disasters that affected the country. But as a leader in the region, can you tell me a little or shed some light for those present on how the most vulnerable access the benefits from the programs after a disaster event, what we've learned from it, and how we've improved on that from, say, the last 10 years or the last major event till now?
All right, so the PATH program was born back in 2001, and it's one of the early conditional cash transfer programs worldwide. And it was born out of the need to provide support to persons who are poor. However, over the years, we have built on that program where, the premise of the program was how do we break the intergenerational cycle of poverty. But moving away from that, that's our underlying goal. But over the years, it is how do we now strengthen those households that are on the program so that they can graduate, or when you have an event that the impact would be minimized or they would be able to rebuild quickly. So, the program has a long history. So what we have done over the years, and the question is how do you access the PATH program? So we have a network of offices right across the island where persons can come to us. But we also work very closely with our local partners, the local government, the Ministry of Local Government, you have the Social Development Commission, then you have your NGO type entities. ADRA was mentioned as one. You have your Red Cross, Salvation Army, and so forth. And you have your network of persons who basically, we work very closely with them and of course our members of parliament. We have our ministers here. We can't forget our members of parliament who we try to work very closely with to enable us to identify who is in need of assistance and support, and to be able to now use the program to provide that kind of assistance. If you don't mind, I know I'm sitting here as a panelist, but I wanted to say that we use a mechanism, a targeting mechanism, to be able to identify who is poor. My colleague here from the Dominican Republic has spoken about the vulnerability index. And I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, and I know I'm a panelist, but I'm asking this like I'm a member of the audience. And I'm sitting here thinking, how do we now strengthen what we have? How do we look at it, strengthen it, to include a vulnerability index? Because the method that we use to target beneficiaries for PATH, it's a proxy means test that really is looking at your vulnerability to poverty. And so I'm now sitting here thinking, how do we take it to the next level where we're not just looking at poverty, but how do we look at the household's vulnerability using maybe a similar approach or, a combined approach to poverty and vulnerability. So, my colleague from DOMREP, I am very curious. I would love to, maybe if there isn't time for the panel, but I'd love to literally hear more about you and what you do in DOMREP. I must tell you that, with any program, we have areas of inclusion and areas of exclusion. And so you're going to have people who you include who really shouldn't be there, and you have people who you exclude who really should be there. So I'm thinking if we can strengthen what we do through learning from you, then maybe we'd be able to minimize some of those errors.
Okay. It has to be very brief, but we can keep talking after the panel. The IVAC is one of the 3 index that we have at SUBAN. We have our primary index, that is the quality of life index, that is the one that we use to target for the conditionary cash transfer. That is the primary index for our institution. And it's the one, after that we have the IVAC, that we use the Logit model, and we use characteristic of the household. We calculate, we don't have income questions in our questionnaire, but what we do to Miseriano, and we calculate, we have a proxy of the income, and we have other question in our questionnaire that is how far or how near you are to a river, a creek, marine coast. So with these variables, we construct the IVAC, and we have a probability of how vulnerable that household is. And the third index that we have, and is our newest one, is the MPI using the Alkire-Foster methodology from Oxford University. And we also, inside the privation of those households that are measured in the MPI, we use the variables of how close are those households to the danger zone. So I know that we have small time here, but if you like, we can keep talking outside.
All right, I think we need to try to close it up. So, a large part of having this symposium is for these types of exchanges. So I think that exchange sort of overtook any sort of closing, because otherwise my closing stands between you all and lunch. I would, however, like to make a couple of quick points that have been bouncing around in my head since these conversations started. I mean, there's been a lot of studies around the world about how investments in preparedness ultimately save money in the response side. And I realize, again, the fiscal limitations throughout the Caribbean, the levels of the debt throughout the Caribbean are a major obstacle, let's say, to investing in population. But I think some of the comments that came out throughout the panels here, whether it's looking at whether people are citizens or not, or human rights approach when an event happens, or the understanding that addressing poverty helps raise that resilience so that need is reduced in the future, are all quite important points that we need to take away from this. I think listening to the last panel and also this one, you hear a lot when you talk with disaster management actors about how disaster management is the response of basically all of government, right? But we've been hearing over the course of this morning essentially the same message from our social protection counterparts, that social protection is more than just this one individual program. It is an overall system. So we have two sets of actors both saying that their area of work is the responsibility of all of government, right? So I think that whole point on coordination really comes home. I mean, we purposely asked Dominican Republic to purposely speak on this because we know that there is a large appetite for this, and it is a financial investment, and that links to a number of other questions. But again, the more I think we know about a population, their vulnerabilities, both pre-crisis and the potential increase in vulnerabilities after a shock happens is critical for this debate on assisting populations in a timely manner, right? I think there's also the realm, and it sounds as if in Dominican Republic it is incorporated, but all of the disaster vulnerability analysis that's taking place throughout the region, that doesn't necessarily creep into the discussion on social protection. So this idea of sweeps, you can prioritize where you do your sweep based on poverty indicators, based on vulnerability indicators, et cetera. So I think there's a lot to explore, and I hope that over the course of the afternoon, we're able to exchange a little bit more and build that momentum. Again, just to highlight on the financial side, so this symposium was specifically targeting a ministerial level, building on the SEDIMA Council of Ministers meeting to help raise that profile. And we know that individual ministers have their struggles to advocate for their whole portfolio, but we need to raise that voice a little bit on some of these ex-ante investments. So, thank you very much, and thank you to our 4 excellent panelists.
Thank you.
Hello? Okay, here we go. All right, before we go to lunch, we just have 1 or 2 things to share. The first, I would invite Liz. We're going to play a video for SEDIMA, and Liz is just going to introduce it for us just before lunch. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we want to invite you to view a video, SEDIMA's Legacy Projects Post-Hurricanes Irma and Maria Towards a Caribbean Pathway for Building Resilience. Following the catastrophic Category 5 Hurricanes Irma and Maria in September 2017, which resulted in major damage to the SEDIMA participating states of Antigua and Barbuda, the British Virgin Islands, the Turks and Caicos Islands, and the Commonwealth of Dominica, CARICOM states and development partners, both regional and international, pledged and/or donated funds to the recovery and reconstruction efforts through the SEDIMA Coordinating Unit. This was agreed to be in the form of what we call legacy projects. The aim of the legacy projects is to improve the socio-economic conditions of the most vulnerable persons in the most adversely affected areas of the impacted states. 4 projects were identified, one in each of the impacted states. In Dominica, the project targeted the indigenous population, specifically through support for minor repairs and re-roofing of houses within the Kalinago territory, which were amongst the most severely damaged. In Antigua and Barbuda, a donation of US $50,000 was provided to provide food vouchers in support of the most vulnerable displaced families from Barbuda. In the Virgin Islands, the Autism Center and the Long Trench Community Center were rehabilitated through the donation of US $70,000. And in the Turks and Caicos Islands, a donation of US $70,000 was provided to assist in the development of the Education Management Information System, post-IRMA, through the contribution of 88 computers to the Ministry of Education. We now invite you to view the video. Thank you.
friendly governments across the globe who contributed to being of response effort.
They choose me as one and some others to cover. I am very satisfied with what all of them do. I don't know how to praise all of you. And to speak the truth, I will never, ever be able to give my mother a new free soul. Praise God for all you.
It wasn't for all you, all I can be real to you guys. Because we will be saying stuff over here and that's here. God bless man. God bless.
Whoever came up with the idea to choose us, it was no one, it was really unneeded. Because I stayed on the top back roof with tackling. And let me tell you something, sometimes when the wind high, it was like living the same thing over because of the tackling making the noise. You know, I cannot pay back unless I be able to pay back. So I would say, thank you to those who sponsor the roof.
In the case of Antigua and Barbuda, SEDIMA provided $50,000 to the government of Antigua to deal with the sheltering of individuals who were displaced from the island of Barbuda for over 2 weeks.
The Legacy project is one of those projects that was very timely. The way to structure is that if you were a single person up to, I think it was up to 3 in a family, you get a particular amount. If you were in the middle range, you get a particular amount. And so if your family fall above a particular number of members in the family, then you get the higher tier.
In the Turks and Caicos Island, we provided $70,000 to assist with the educational sector in providing support for the restoration on the island of Provinciales.
SEDIMA and their donors, we are grateful for this extraordinary kindness that is evident in your presentation of 88 laptop computers to the TCI, the Ministry of Education, Youth, Culture, and Library Services.
In the British Virgin Islands, we provided a total of $140,000 to assist with restoration to the Long Trench Community Center and also the School for Autism. A very important feature of our Legacy project is its link to our resilience pathway, where we focus on several critical pillars for advancing resilience in SEDIMA member states. The Legacy project provides direct support to at least 2 of those pillars. One, to Pillar 1, which looks at social protection for the marginalized, vulnerable, as you have seen. It also supports Pillar 2, which looks at critical infrastructure. In the restoration work we would have done with schools in Turks and Caicos Island, in the BVI, and also following the 2010 earthquake in Haiti.
I understand you want to see them for assisting us in the housing. I noticed that there were some contractors that were given an opportunity to repair some of the roads in the Clerveaux territory, and that we thank you for that because it shows that the economy of the Clerveaux territory can revive, but there are people from the community getting employed and employing other persons with us.
So the houses that were built before, they were not as strong as what is built now. And so we are approaching hurricane season, and I believe that persons in the community who are benefiting from that project are much more comfortable.
So it was a wonderful project at the end, and I think the Clerveaux space is very good.
And what you find is that now persons don't have to be worried about if they're going to have leaking roofs or if their roof is going to come off during a hurricane. So they have that measure of safety, knowing now that their homes are to a standard that is accepted not just locally but internationally.
Some of them were expressing that they would welcome persons or their neighbors around who are not feeling safe at home to come over to their homes.
Now that we have the roof, it gives a greater level of
security in terms of our lives and some of our personal products. And I guess so too we could maybe help our neighbor.
SEDIMO wishes to thank those donors who have contributed to our efforts at raising funds not only in response but also providing much needed support. As we look forward, current and future aspirations of our legacy project will seek to support the all hazards concept as referenced in our comprehensive disaster management strategy, noting that the region is not only vulnerable to climate-related hazards, but also to seismic shocks, including volcanic eruptions. We also recognize that there are other threats that are facing the region, and as such, in advancing and expanding our mandate for early recovery and reconstruction, the Legacy Project will seek to not only support recovery from all of these hazards, but promote resilience building in our member states.
Okay, so we're actually at 1 o'clock. And I just want to remind everyone that would have put a question on Slido that they are being responded to. So you can look back at that. And just before you take your lunch, we would invite you to take your stuff with you, because when you return to the room, it will be completely different. Yeah. So thank you very much for your participation, and we'll see you at 2 o'clock. Lunch should be right there in the courtyard.